Okay, well, welcome. My name is Andrew Krepanevich. I'm president of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. And we're joined today with colleagues from three of our sister think tanks. We have Tom Donnelly here from the American Enterprise Institute, Bob Work for the Center for New American Security, my colleague Jim Thomas, Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and Clark Murdoch at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And the reason we're here, well, you have to kind of go back about 18 months or so when the Budget Control Act was passed. And initially it was assumed that somehow this couldn't possibly happen and we would all find a way to work around it. And here we are some months later, and we're now living it. And it looks like we may have to live with it for a long time. And the purpose here is for these four think tanks to brief out the results of a strategic planning exercise that they engaged in last week, the four think tanks together, each working the issue independently. And the idea was to take a serious look at the implications of sequestration, but to do so within a strategic context. That is to say, not view the challenge of sequestration simply as a cut drill, which required a haircut in Pentagon parlance, but actually an opportunity and also a challenge to reorient defense priorities in a way that supported a coherent strategy. You have their bios, these four gentlemen here, who are going to each present, so I won't bore you with them, although they are all impressive. The way we're going to proceed is that first, Todd Harrison, my colleague at CSBA, will give you a presentation on the planning tool that was used by each of the four groups to come up with their approach to the sequestration cuts. And there is an option A and an option B. Option A is sort of the full Monty. It's $522 billion in cuts between FY14 and FY23. The kinder, gentler option B calls for roughly $247 billion in cuts over the same time frame. And again, these are not cuts that any of us are, any of our think tanks are advocating. It's rather an attempt to live within the constraints of the real world. Following Todd's explication, we'll go in alphabetical order according to think tanks. So we'll start with Tom Donnelly and work our way down to Clark Murdoch. Each, in order to save time, sufficient time for questions, each person will have 10 minutes. I'll be sitting there, and I know these guys. And, absent a tranquilizer dart, which I don't have, it's going to be a challenge for me to keep them under 10 minutes. So when you see me stand up and walk over there, I think the appropriate response on your part is to start mumbling for shame, or something along those lines. And I'm not even sure that will work, but you ought to give it a try. So again, I would also point out that there are no magic solutions here. Strategy involves making hard choices. The kind of cuts we're talking about require hard choices, requiring deciding not only what you're going to do, but what you're not going to do. And I think that's very important. And again, we didn't give people the option for, hey, here are $500 billion worth of efficiency savings, and so everything stays the same and we all go home happy tonight. That's been a hardy perennial whenever it comes time to cut the defense budget. I've been around longer than I care to admit. It's an attractive option, but all it does is to defer the hard choices. And we did not give these people the opportunity to do that, and I think you'll see it in their presentations today. Once they're finished, Todd will come up and he'll give you a brief overview of where the four groups really came together in terms of areas where they thought we really needed to invest, maybe even more than we're investing now, despite the cuts, but also areas where we could take some risk, an acceptable level of risk, even with reduced funding. So enough of me. Let's turn it over to the talent here. And Todd, why don't you take over and give them the rundown? Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I will take you through quickly the premise of the exercise and the challenge that we gave to all the teams represented here. So the objective here was for the teams to take their own strategy, their own approach for rebalancing the defense budget over the next 10 years and put it into action, and do so under the constraints, under the stress, if you will, of budget cuts. And so we devised this to operate over 2 FYDPs. The first FYDP, FY 14 to 18, the second FYDP, 19 to 23. And we gave them 2 different budget scenarios, 2 different levels of cuts. And the idea was to explore what are the major trade-offs you have to make, where are the areas where you're going to invest no matter what, where are the areas where you're going to cut no matter what, and where are the areas where you're going to have to take risk because of the budget cuts. And the idea here was to keep it focused on what are the major capability trades, not get bogged down in specific program choices as you do this, but keep it at a level of, what are the big capabilities that are going to be most important and least important going into the future. A note here, the results you're going to see today from these 4 teams represent the opinions and the options selected by these 4 teams. They do not necessarily represent institutional positions of the think tanks they come from. So just want to state that up front. So we made several assumptions going into this exercise. We started with the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance. Gave that, to all the teams. Of course, they had already read it and studied it quite a bit, I'm sure. And said, hey, use this as a starting point, and you can go wherever you want with your strategy. So just tell us how you're changing it from the current strategic guidance. And then we gave them, as I said before, 2 budget level cuts. But we did revise things a bit for the purposes of the exercise. We gave them virtually complete flexibility in what to target in their budget cuts and in their ads. Of course, political reality sets in, and you realize that you can't do everything that you would like to do because you do have to get 535 members of Congress to consider it. We also we ran the budget cuts over a 10-year period, so it would be a nice even 2 FYDPs. That extended through FY 23. And keep in mind that the Budget Control Act, the caps in the Budget Control Act, they actually end in FY 21. We just did a straight line extension of them for an extra 2 years. And we also gave them the flexibility, instead of trying to make their budget balance each year in the 10-year period, which would have taken a lot longer, we just said, look, you've got to balance it and reach the target level of cuts in each FYDP. So they were able to move money implicitly within each FYDP. All of those things made it a little easier to do this. The bottom bullet point here I want to emphasize, we also started them with some very generous assumptions. We let them assume that all of the proposed compensation reform in the 2013 budget request, so things like raising TRICARE fees, reducing the growth in basic pay, things like that, we let them assume that all of that actually happens. So your compensation costs are not growing out of control. You actually have modest growth in compensation costs. And so we didn't give them an option in the game to do anything else with compensation reform. We said, look, we're just assuming it's already in there. It's already baked in. That's a generous assumption, of course. And keep in mind, as people show you all of their cuts, that if you don't get that compensation reform, you would actually have to cut a lot more. Also, efficiency initiatives that Andrew mentioned, we let them assume that all of the efficiencies DOD has already banked the savings for from the last, I think, 3 budget requests. We let them assume that all of those efficiencies come true. And of course, it's highly unlikely that all of the efficiencies will come true and they will be able to realize every bit of those savings. But nevertheless, we let them assume that they would get all those efficiencies, and then we did not give them an option to add even more efficiencies to it. So those are 2 pretty generous assumptions, and I just point that out to keep in mind as people present their results. It would be a lot worse had we not given them these easy assumptions. So our approach here, each team got to individually go through and develop their own rebalancing strategy. We had them use our tool, which I'll show you a few pictures of that in a second, to make their investment and divestment decisions over the 2 FYDPs. The 2 scenarios for budget cuts, scenario A was the full BCA level cuts. Over that 10-year period, so extended out to FY23, that would amount to $522 billion in cuts relative to the baseline. The baseline is the FY13 budget request and projection. Scenario B, we said, hey, you get to buy something back. We're only going to give you half the cuts under the BCA, and we're going to backload them. And so it's actually a little easier to do that if the cuts are disproportionately made in the second fight-up. And so I'll show you what this looks like graphically. The dashed blue line you see on the top, that's the baseline that all of the adds and cuts were being made from. Scenario A, the full BCA cuts, you can see that's what the cuts add up to, $260 billion in that first fight-up, $261 billion in the second fight-up. Scenario B, the half Budget Control Act cuts that are backloaded, you see it's a gradual ramp down, as you see in that orange line there. So the cuts build over time. It's only $56 billion in cuts in the first fight-up, $191 billion in cuts in the second fight-up. And that actually makes a big difference, whether or not the cuts are backloaded when you play this through. And I'll show you the rebalancing tool that we used. It had over 650 different options of things to add or cut. So the teams had plenty of things to choose from, to invest in and divest of. The options, since there's so many of them, they're organized by category. And we organized them not by service, but by capability areas, if you will. So the air category, keep in mind as people show you their results, air includes all aircraft, not just Air Force aircraft. So they could go through, they could look at descriptions of the options, what it would do, how much it would save them in the first fight-up, how much it would save them in the second fight-up, and they could select different increments, you know, the number of BCTs they would want to add or cut, the number of aircraft they would want to add or cut. They have all that flexibility in the tool. So without saying more, I will turn it over to Tom to go through his team's presentation.
Thanks, Todd. I do want to say a special thanks to CSBA and to Todd in particular for putting this herd of cats together. And I look forward to see how my colleagues or the other teams solve these very challenging problems. I've got 7 slides to get through and 10 minutes to do it, so this is going to go as fast as I possibly can. And you will see that I've been doing or following quadrennial defense reviews way too long, so many of the tropes of past QDRs are going to have slipped into the presentation. They're going to be silly headlines like, you know, at least you notice win is absent from the headline, and there are some sort of Kabbalistic numerical formula that we'll refer to just for you. They're QDR jokes for you QDR veterans. I also want to say thanks to my teammates, Mackenzie Eaglin and Phil Lowhouse. We've really expanded our defense work at AEI over the last couple of years since we planted the flag at the Maryland War Center. It's a delight to have both of them work with me now in Mackenzie's case for about 18 months. So if there's a problem with the presentation, it's their fault and not mine. All right, so here we go. We have to start with the bottom line up front. All I can offer you is roads to failure, roads to defeat. The question is, how fast and how straight are they going to be? And one insight I took away from the whole exercise is that even absent any sequestration cuts or a deal that cuts sequestration in half, that the current levels of spending are going to be inadequate to maintain the international system that the United States has built over the last 7 decades. And I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but essentially anything less than the minimum force to cover our global commitments will mean systemic failure in our judgment. But to play the game, this is how we tried to sort of spread the butter across the toast, so to speak. And the question is, again, how fast and how soon are we going to get to failure? Which meant, particularly for us, that we thought near-term risk was the essential hurdle, the first hurdle to get over. If we don't have a peaceful world in 5 years, it won't matter what's on the drawing boards or in the pipeline. So, also, apropos of the guidance, We got to, even though we used the president's guidance as the jumping off point, we went back to the essential goals of the QDR independent panel, which Mackenzie and I both did clerical work for a couple of years ago. But it is an outstanding bipartisan sort of definition of what the United States has done, the way we've behaved over the past decades, and the components of the broad great power peace that we now enjoy. So this is what we're trying to preserve. This is our definition of victory. And this is how we're going to try to get there. At least in the current environment, two things are important. We have to deter China from upsetting the balance of power in East Asia and elsewhere, and we have to reverse the withdrawal that's now underway in the Middle East. In my judgment, that withdrawal is something like, and could even be worse than, the American withdrawal from Europe after 1918. We're going to pay for that again. And the sooner we get back to it, the cheaper it'll be. And that ought to be the first goal of defense planning. How are we going to cover the bets? Well, we're not going to do things in the old joint way. We've got to take a lot of risk. Essentially, our goal was to put the sea services, give them responsibility for the Pacific, patrolling the Pacific, give the Army the responsibility for reclaiming our position in the greater Middle East, and if anything got out of hand, we'd have a big Air Force to bomb people with. That's what we had as a backup. Not very much depth, but a little bit more breadth. And we also took the requirement to rebuild our nuclear forces in a multilateral nuclear environment as something that required investment. But this is a tripwire, and nothing more than that. And I'll quickly go through the particulars. So both sea services need to be, again, the idea is they only go to the Pacific except in extremis. So we have to shrink them, but modernize them. I do not want carriers with fourth-generation fighters on them. These airplanes have been fabulous airplanes for a long time, but they can't survive in the emerging environment. So we want to get to the next generation as fast as we could do. And it's just a question of how much money you have to spend. I won't go through the particulars in detail. Please feel free to ask questions about them, and I'm sure Todd will put out the particulars, the spreadsheets, and go through some of the differences and commonalities. Likewise, it's the Army that's got to cover the greater Middle East, that part of the planet that's constantly in turmoil, from West Africa to beyond the Persian Gulf. We tried to preserve Army end strength at the cost of modernization. Not that there's very much modernization in the Army to worry about either way. And to retain a heavy core so that if we did need to mobilize for a large-scale contested operation, there was at least a nucleus to mobilize around. And we took away from special operations forces. Less global manhunt. We also killed the Predator orbits by 2/3, disbanded MARSOC, and as you see, cut the direct action force significantly. And that didn't change regardless of how much money we had to play with. So the one ace we have in reserve under our strategy is air power and nuclear forces. I don't think that what we came up with is really what I would call an adequately sized Air Force. And just because of where we are today, it's impossible to get to much in the way of new capabilities. We threw every dollar that we could at a new bomber, but we thought it was important to modernize the fighter fleet. That's all the mass we're ever going to have in terms of firepower. One thing that we did add is intermediate range ballistic missiles to the land forces, to the Army. Since everybody else is threatening us and our allies with missiles, we thought it'd be fair game to turn the tables and not rely entirely on manned aircraft or unmanned aircraft, but if ballistic missiles are the cheap man's long-range firepower, we could use some of that too. And as I said earlier, we thought it was essential to reinvest in a nuclear deterrent. We're no longer in a bipolar, well-defined deterrence regime. There are just many more players in the game, and their goals are much different. We have, if you start looking at the social science of deterrence, and start thinking about the modern world, it'll just give you a giant headache. The one thing that we could be sure of is that where we're headed is the wrong direction. Finally, if anything larger than we can control with our patrolling forces were to occur, we're going to be in deep kimchi. There are a lot of scenarios. I can't handicap them, but they're not unrealistic. I didn't make these up. We didn't make these up. Whether it's a North Korea collapse, China decides to snatch something, we decide we can't live with the mullahs in Iran any longer, we get the coin disease again, you name it. Anything that we want to do besides keep the lid on the world is going to be hard to do, and it's going to take a long time to mobilize forces to get there, particularly if you're talking about a reserve call-up. Industrial mobilization, making more things, would even be a greater struggle and take longer. We'd have to throw a lot of money at it. And the question of allied participation, I think, is a much more open question. Our allies read us. When they see us withdrawing from the world, they're not going to stick their necks out any farther than we're willing to do so. So I think we have to think that, rethink that. And we had some options in the game, say, to transfer F-35 to partner countries. We think that's an excellent idea. And in particularly, I would be very worried, we're going to go into a very much home-based CONUS posture. So getting to where we're going to have to fight and where we would prefer to fight, and in particularly going the last 10 or 15% is going to be very difficult to do at a very risky tactical, operational, and even strategic and political calculation. And I think the final takeaway is we're doing this to ourselves. The amount of funding that we're talking about is not going to affect our national debt, the annual deficit, the fiscal condition of the government, the growth of our economy. In the size of the American economy, we're talking about chump change. But in the effect in the world, which I think is the ultimate measure, the ultimate metric of strategy and defense planning, we're taking huge risks, and we don't have to. I look at the Middle East, I don't see a tide of war that's receding. I see a tide of American power that's receding. I don't know whether China is deterred or not. I'm not talking about containing China. I'm talking strictly about a military strategy of deterrence, preventing the Chinese from upsetting the current order by the use of military force in a preemptive way, or coercing and intimidating states who are our friends and are our allies. This is a system that's produced unprecedented, historically unprecedented peace, prosperity, and liberty, and it faces a single point of failure kind of collapse. I think that's a very bad idea. I'm glad we played this game because it showed us what the costs would be of further cuts and how cheap it would be to avoid the geopolitical costs of the cuts. But other than that, I hated every minute of it. I look forward to your questions and to the others' presentations. Thanks for putting up with it.
Good afternoon, everybody. I find the prospect of addressing a crowd in a public forum and saying what I actually think both exhilarating and frightening. Had a great team, and I'd like to echo Tom's really great thanks to CSBA for setting this up. Every model has its own unique aspects, but by and large, I think it's extremely successful in pointing out the big muscle moves that you have to make. Okay, our major rebalancing assumptions. The 2012 defense guidance we think is sound. Rebalance to Asia, remain engaged in the Middle East, but with fewer boots on the ground. No major near-term stability coin campaigns. Of course, our enemies have a vote. Reduce military engagement in what I will call economy of force theaters in this environment. We're not likely to engage in a direct conventional conflict with a high-end adversary in the near to midterm. However, we are ever mindful that our monopoly and the guided munitions battle network regime is steadily eroding, and it's weakening conventional deterrence, as Tom said, and it's also complicating our ability to project power. But more than anything, our group thought that we're in a period of potential discontinuous change. Additive manufacturing, 3D printing, big data, nano, biotechnology, autonomous systems. Over the course of the next 2 to 3 decades, we can see some major changes. We therefore see a shift, an ongoing shift at the early stages to what we refer to as a new warfighting regime, which we refer to as 20YY, because we don't want to get into a debate on when we think it's going to happen. 20XX is the long-range precision strike regime, which the Office of Net Assessment explored in detail in the 1990s. So in this regime, the United States will unquestionably face adversaries with guided munitions battle network parity. Cyber warfare is going to be an integral part of war at all three levels of war. Robotics and autonomous unmanned systems and sensors will be ubiquitous in all operating domains. So we didn't take it such a dark view as Tom. We thought this as a period, an actual opportunity, where we have a chance to reshape both the joint force and the industrial base for a long-term competition to make sure that we retain our technological edge and can dominate in this incoming regime. We're willing to take near-term risk to get to where we want to go, which is a long-term payoff in our view. So we're going to have smaller, network, more lethal forces in the meantime, and we need to remain engaged globally, but with a lot smarter way of doing it, and we want to exploit the power of demonstrations to demonstrate to our allies that we can actually get to where we want to go, how we want to get there, and do what we want to do when we get there. This is a minimum 4 FYDP strategy. It could potentially be 6 or 7 FYDPs long. But we took the long view and said at a minimum it's going to be 4. So in FYDP 1, we assumed a lot of risk to lay the groundwork for a major shift towards this regime, which we call 20YY. In the second FYDP, we began to invest extremely heavily in this regime. And by the FYDP 3, we see an acceleration. And by FYDP 4, we think we're going to be in a mature regime where guided munitions and battle networking will be ubiquitous, and there'll be robotics everywhere. Now, I want to make sure that you don't think that all we see is a high-tech future. We see this proliferation in every level of war, in irregular warfare and in high-end warfare. The only reason Iron Dome works is that 70% of the unguided rockets that are fired hit nothing. If all of the rockets fired were guided, it would be an entirely different view. Hezbollah has them, and our adversaries will. We also were ever mindful of the industrial base. In the 50s, the transition from pistons engines to jet. In the 60s, missiles in space, computers and digital electronics. There was something in the defense industry that was really pulling the industrial base along and keeping our industrial edge. We think this exercise was really focusing on autonomy and robotic systems, and we need an industrial base that can get us there. Our general principles were we cut overhead to the greatest extent practical in the model. We were only allowed to cut 1/3 of anything with the expectation that any more than 1/3 in a FYDP would be too disruptive. We had a BRAC. We cut every opportunity we had in the model. We adopted tier readiness in all the forces. We preserved S&T and tried to increase it if at all possible. We invested in weapons that attempt to address the offensive dominance of the guided weapons regime. If you get electromagnetic railguns that are able to kill ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, and possibly even artillery rockets and mortars, then you have a major change and you have some time before you have to really make big changes to your forces. To the greatest extent possible, we went to robotics. We retained and emphasized globally responsive forces. That meant to us aerospace, SOF, and naval forces, and we pursued a high-low mix for both naval and air, pretty much like Tom did. And we invested in overseas and basing and global logistics to the greatest extent possible. So these were our specific choices. We retained a nuclear triad, but with less emphasis on ICBMs, and we kept the Ohio replacement program intact. We have a smaller Army focused on campaign fighting, less focused on global shaping and more on institutional reshaping. We focused more on an active Army and cut mainly reserves. Because we want, when you have a smaller force, we feel we have to be ready, and we have to be ready to go. Smaller tactical air forces, again with a high-low mix by the end of the second FYDP, 50% fifth-generation fighters. A smaller Navy. One thing you'll notice, everything is smaller. Smaller, 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 smaller. There's no other way to do it when you have this level. And the Navy is a high-low mix, focused primarily on the Burke-class destroyer and the LCS. The Marine Corps reverts to its traditionally expeditionary force and readiness role. We actually cut Marine reserves, and we kept the active Marine Corps and the amphibious forces necessary to get them around the world. Not necessarily to do amphibious forcible entry, but to allow them to do their traditional force and readiness role. We retained special ops, and we kept all of our air and sea mobility forces because we want to get our smaller forces wherever they need to go very quickly. Choices in Move 1 allowed us to do a rapid fielding of electromagnetic railguns, which we think is a game changer in this regime, at least in the near term, and we accelerated procurement of unmanned systems in every domain. We invested in increased autonomy in both moves. Savings in Move 1 allowed us to have increased investment in directed energy weapons in the second FYDP, in space, cyber, munitions, and overseas infrastructure. We simply couldn't afford them in the first FYDP, although we wanted them. This gives you an idea of what we did. The red are where we took all the cuts, and you can see on the personnel side, that's where you get the savings. It's the only way you can make this work. Do I think we would make these number of cuts in the first FYDP? We could possibly do it. It would be disastrous. It would be it would cause so much turmoil in the force. But that's the only way you're going to get to these forces, and I think Congress needs to address this issue. They need to quit fooling themselves. On the half sequestration, we made exactly the same force structure choices that we made at full sequestration. The only thing we did is we moved faster to the 20YY regime. That is where we think a smaller force is going to maintain global preeminence. And the only thing we did buy back was readiness in the first one. Now, I said, this model is very unique, but it has its own, its own problems. And we did not see sequestration not as necessarily as big of a problem as the phasing. The model allowed us to just hit the targets in the FYDP. If we can have to hit the targets by year in 14 and 15, the wheels will come off. And I'm speaking from personal experience here. There is no way around it. We cannot fool ourselves. With all of the cuts we've made in 13, if we have to take a full BCA cut in 14 at $50 billion, we will go back to the 1975 era where I am buying toilet paper for my Marines. It will be a national travesty. So we need to focus on the phasing, less on the overall level. We need to increase DoD's degrees of freedom. We would have had a much bigger BRAC. We would have had a much bigger compensation. We weren't allowed to do that. Congress needs to open this up, because if they can't, as you can see, this is pretty ugly. We can get there in very much, we believe, in a much more logical manner if we have degrees of freedom. Under any circumstances, if you take these levels of cuts, you are going to take substantial near-term risk. There's no other way around it, and I think we all just need to address that. We believe we have to prepare now to move towards this mature guided munitions regime. We are not advocating just high-tech battle in the future. We think our adversaries at every level will be truly hybrid, with this type of capability everywhere. We better be making this change now, and so sequestration we see as an opportunity. It's a jump start towards this future. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
I want to start by thanking my teammates from CSBA who are listed up here. We had a great team and a good day on Friday. And I also want to thank my colleagues from AEI and from CNAS and from CSIS for participating and for taking the time to be part of this exercise. Let me start with the strategic context in terms of what our CSBA team was trying to do. Fundamentally, we saw that addressing America's fiscal predicament and its implications for DoD was really only one imperative that we faced. The other imperative that we saw was equally, if not even of greater importance, was addressing growing weapons of mass destruction and anti-access and area denial challenges we face around the world. We did not see this as a strategic choice, but rather as a strategic necessity and an imperative if we want to remain in the superpower business. The key test for us, therefore, was, as we evaluated the defense program, was the extent to which the forces that we were going to invest in, how well they would perform in increasingly contested, non-permissive environments. We wanted to increase investments in those capabilities and forces that performed well in non-permissive environments, while decreasing investments in those that did not. And our goal overall, similar to what our colleagues at CNAS was doing, was trying to achieve a better high-low mix of capabilities and forces across the joint force. In particular, seeking a better balance between combat strike power, range, survivability, and sustainability. So we wanted to ensure a strategic-driven approach, that this wasn't just going to be a budget drill of going and cutting everything. So the first thing we did is actually said, what are we going to increase funding in? We start here with, as Andy Krepanevich said, a little over $500 billion bogey across 10 years. We actually dug our hole a little deeper to start by trying to figure out where we were going to invest. And the big trade we were going to make is we said it's better to have a smaller force. That is, we're going to have less capacity, but we're going to have capabilities that are better suited for the sorts of operating environments that we're going to face. Therefore, we gave priority to force shaping over force sizing. And we did our best to protect readiness across the exercise, both at the full Budget Control Act sequestration level cuts as well as at half of that, but we failed in terms of our ability to do that at the full BCA level of cuts. Bottom line, in the full BCA, we traded personnel force structure and some readiness for this expanded capability suite to address future challenges. At half BCA, we were able to buy back 100% of readiness, albeit with a smaller force. And this box here really kind of outlines what some of those crown jewels are. Capabilities that we thought would be most viable for projecting power into contested environments, and that we would place priority on as we went through the exercise. This next slide just gives you an overall sense of our rebalancing effort. And as you can see, we took the most risk in the areas of personnel and in readiness, as well as in our air capabilities. We did the most rebalancing in terms of air, sea, as well as space, cyber, and communications. Now I'll unpack these categories and walk through some of the details. In terms of the air and sea categories, we traded a lot of TAC air for longer range and multi-mission air systems. And let me say up front, this is not just about air and just about the Air Force, but this is about air capabilities across all of the services. We ended up with a smaller force. We had about 1,100 fewer aircraft overall, but increases in stealthy fighters, advanced unmanned systems, and bombers. We accelerated the fielding of LRS-B. We terminated a more counterterrorism-focused Navy UCLASS program and initiated development of a multi-mission sea-based UCAS program better suited for A2AD environments. We retired legacy aircraft, both in terms of tactical aircraft as well as our B-1s. And we maxed out munitions to the greatest extent possible. Enhanced bunker buster munitions, advanced electronic warfare systems, high-powered microwave weapons that could go against multiple targets, and longer-range both air-to-air and anti-ship weapons. We also developed a super inertial navigation system capability for navigation for I think would be a JDAM add-on for later. And across the board, again, as Bob was saying, we really tried to max out autonomy for unmanned systems that would be able to operate going beyond remotely piloted. In terms of sea capabilities, we tried to max out naval combat power as opposed to the number of ships. So we weren't really focused on fleet size as a metric. That said, more by happenstance, we ended up with a larger fleet size, going from about 285 ships today to about 300 under the full BCA cuts. Big increases on the Navy side were in terms of combat logistics ships. We thought that this was a major hole in our current fleet design. Minesweepers, and we also added submarines and UUVs. In terms of sea investments, S&T investments, we put particular emphasis on directed energy systems as well as electromagnetic railguns. We retired all of our cruisers, we cut 2 aircraft carriers, and we also reduced the LCS buy. With respect to Army, Marine Corps, and Special Operations Forces, we reduced Army force structure, going from 65 down to 41 BCTs in total across both the active and reserve components, and our in-strength was reduced, and Army in-strength was reduced to 420,000 active component and 539 Guard and Reserves. We developed a new land-based capability for missile defense. With respect to the Marine Corps, we cut Marine Corps active component disproportionately. It was least of all of the services, going from 182,000 to 177,000. We saw the Marine Corps as essentially an on-call 911 steady state force that would be immediately employable for crisis response. With respect to Special Operations Forces, we did not add or subtract any force structure in strength, but rather we focused on increasing SOF capabilities and investments for persistent engagement, as well as increasing their capabilities for operations in denied environments. Such capabilities included clandestine SOF insertion from both the air and the undersea, a special communication system for operating in denied areas, as well as biometric identity masking, tagging, tracking, locating capabilities, and non-lethal weapons. With respect to space, cyber capabilities, communications, as well as our strategic forces and logistics and basing, we made a big increase in terms of cyber warfare capabilities, both for offense and defense, but we were biased in the direction of offense. Again, going back to the emphasis we wanted to place on maximizing combat power. We invested on the space side in protected SATCOM as well as non-GPS next-generation navigation systems and increased space situational awareness. With respect to our strategic nuclear forces, we developed an ICBM replacement, but in the first fit-up under the full BCA amount, we reduced the ICBM force by one wing. But we also invested in a B-61 life extension replacement system. In terms of logistics and basing, we placed emphasis on bare-base dispersal, rapid runway repair kits, and increasing number of aircraft shelters, particularly in the Western Pacific. We also developed an ability to rearm vertical launch system tubes at sea, and we're going to, in terms of infrastructure investment, develop forward rearming stations. Like the other teams, we also invested in BRAC. This is an upfront bill, but we saw it was really critical to get our CONUS basing structure in line for the future and to rationalize that structure. So personnel and readiness took the biggest hits, arguably under the full BCA amount for us. We traded military in-strength civilian personnel and contract support for robust future capabilities. Overall, we reduced the total force by about 18%, going from 3 million down to about 2.46 million, including civilians. We tried to protect readiness, and in fact, in the second fit-up under the full BCA, we restored full readiness. Under the half BCA scenario, the first thing we did was buy back readiness in total, and we also bought back all S&T. We doubled the investments we were making in terms of logistics and basing, with an emphasis on the Western Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region. And we also maxed out a lot of the same capability priorities that we'd made under the full BCA in terms of air, sea, SOF, and other capabilities. In conclusion, there are a couple key points. The first is that although I think everyone in this room would probably agree that further cuts in defense are undesirable, we saw in this exercise that they provided a forcing function in terms of how we thought about rebalancing across the military. Nevertheless, at the full BCA cut, there was a significant, very significant reduction in readiness, and we thought that really would be unavoidable at that level of cuts. And we would encourage Congress to consider that as we think about sequestration. We saw that shifting from the full BCA to the half BCA amount allowed the teams to fully protect readiness and to shift faster towards the development and fielding of some of the key capabilities that we outlined in the first move. But again, and to foot stomp Bob's comments earlier, we really saw this as the best case that you could possibly end up with. If we don't have flexibility in terms of compensation practices and infrastructure and things like BRAC, it would be much harder to achieve this sort of rebalancing. Thank you.
How do you work the clicker? Okay. Join my colleagues, first of all, in thanking them for staying within 10 minutes. I guess I'll have to as well. Note the disclaimer on the bottom. This is a CSIS team led by Clark Murdoch. I had great partners, Ryan Crotty, Vince Manzo, and Josie Gable. And thanks CSBA for arranging all of this. I found it a very productive enterprise. Strong but selective, a more self-interested United States, perhaps also known as Tom Donnelly's greatest nightmare. The first issue that I want to underscore here is this is a strategy. It's a strategy-driven cut drill. So the first thing you have to do is establish the strategy, strategic principles, and then apply them. And that's what we did. This doesn't mean that we recommend, because no one would recommend these kind of draconian cuts with the amount of risk associated with them. But these are the kind of cuts you have to make the numbers, and that's what's in the law. And so part of this is underscoring to people that if we don't change where we are now, these are the kind of alternative scenarios you're looking at. Principal differences from the 2012 DSG. I'm very much of a team player. Those were my instructions to take it as a departure point. First thing we did, strategic retreat from the Middle East while maintaining the defense of Israel. Can't get to the cuts you need without cutting 3 carriers from the force and changing the composition of the carriers as they're in the Asia Pacific. And BPC, building partnership capacity, it's a phrase one of my colleagues first used, count me a skeptic, BPC. I don't know how you can build partnership capacity when no one is spending any more money, they're spending less money. My feeling is by self-interested, I mean pulling the American security blanket back a little bit so that our allies who can afford it start paying more for their own defense, which means that the strategic retreat from the Middle East, yes, a U.S. strategic retreat, but the Europeans who live right there are the ones who have to start providing for their own security. A little more detail on the priority mission areas. I want to talk about key rebalancing assumptions, like CSBA, or rather CSBA like we did 6 months ago when we first did the drill. You make all your ads first. We increased our bill by about $200 billion, plussed up S&T, plussed up space, plussed up comms. In most cases, we did it to the max because what we did is had the plus-ups, then we went for our first round of cuts, then we went back and revisited the personnel, did a little bit more in the way of personnel cuts, then revisited our ads because they were too expensive and moderated our appetites a little bit, then came back and made the final personnel cuts that got us where we are. But it was the personnel cuts you had to go to again and again in order to get to where you needed to be. Tiered readiness across the services, move a lot of the capacity for large ground operations into the reserves. Cut anything that had BPC on it. You know, you have to go through these drills pretty quickly, and each one of them was coded for the kind of thing that it was, so if the letter BPC appeared there, it was gone. The kind of challenging generation, you know, we might go into some ungoverned areas, retain a bit of training in that capacity, but I'm not going to spend any money training allies who aren't going to spend any money on their equipment. Maintain and reshape SOF as a global man-hunting force. What we did essentially is get rid of all of the civil affairs. What left was in the reserves. Did no reconstruction. Not much nation building in this force. This is a hard power force. We tried to increase combat power, as our CSBA colleagues did, but we focused on being the coercive element of U.S. national strategy. We're the stick behind coercive diplomacy. We invested in BRAC, even though it cost us money, because we agree, if you're going to make the kind of personnel cuts we're talking about, you have to do BRAC. At some point, it becomes even too silly for Congress not to do BRAC. Moved active BCTs into the reserves. Took us 2 moves, because you have to cut them during move 1, and then you added them to the reserves in the second one. As a couple of the other teams did, we plussed up Marine readiness, because they are 9/11, post 9/11 readiness force. They are the ones you call 911. We kept the Air Force pretty ready because they have to support the Marines and their kind of activities, and they're also the high-end stop force, hold force that we talked about before. This is the actual process. I've sort of gone through that. This is our summary chart. Again, it shows the extent to which we took the personnel cuts. It shows a lot of green in that because we did a lot of reshaping of the force. But in addition to taking 16 BCTs out of the active Army, putting 10 back into the reserve component, this is about a 40% cut in the Air Force's tactical aviation. Next slide. Again, I talked about the priority capabilities that we plussed up. Want to mention national missile defense. Big believers in that, not investing more in the current generation, but rather putting the investment in the next generation ground-based interceptor. You've got to do homeland defense. If you don't do homeland defense, we're going to be out of the power projection game during that time. So more on national missile defense. Yes, we'll provide theater missile defenses, but only if the Allies pay for it. After all, they're the theater. It's their defense we're talking about. Major trade-offs, I think we've talked about them: modernization over personnel, readiness over personnel, division of labor between the services. When you have these kind of severe cuts, you have to address what we used to call roles and missions issue. I don't think we'd even call them now because I haven't done any of them so long. Areas to accept risk, we've talked about that, but I want to underscore the point that my colleagues have made. There are clearly significant strategic risks to withdrawing from the Middle East. I'm willing to defend that proposition, but there are severe risks, and do you want to do it to the extent that you have to because of these BCA cuts? I would argue no, but that's what you have to do if you're going to make the numbers. Again, the thanks, but I'll repeat again after the disclaimer. This is not a CSIS strategy. This is the implications of implementing the kind of draconian cuts that we're talking about in the Budget Control Act of 2011. Thank you.